Let's start, though, with those comments overnight from Donald Trump. How should politicians react when what he says just isn't true? He said that Ukraine shouldn't have started the war with Russia. We know that that is not the case. This was what Home Office Minister Diana Johnson said.
I think we've been very clear that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia was an act of war against a sovereign state. We've been very clear about that. We've also been very clear to say that Ukraine has to be part of any negotiations. And yesterday, the Secretary of State Rubio was saying that European countries and, of course, Ukraine have to be part of any negotiation. So I think the British position on this is very clear.
That was Dame Diana Johnson speaking for the government. But this was the former Australian Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, who was much more clear.
This idea that you can somehow appease dictators, this idea that might is right, well, that is completely foreign to everything that America and the broader West has stood for these last 70 years. Now, I think we are in a bit of a dangerous place, and I hope that he will think again, and I think that wise heads in Washington will be getting together to think this through.
That was the former Australian Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. Edwina, I want to start with you on this, because what we've been talking about today, aside from the comments, which obviously nobody agrees with what Donald Trump has said, the question is, why are more politicians not willing to publicly call them out, especially serving politicians? Could you give us a bit of an insight into why that might be?
Well, I've got my Ukrainian scarf on, so you can see which side I'm on in this, and my Ukrainian family of refugees are still asleep upstairs because it's half term. Why don't they call it out? I think there's an element of appeasement that has become part of public life. If we've learned anything in Europe, anything at all, especially from our parents' generation, it's that appeasement never has a good outcome. It never has a good outcome. Trump is talking complete rubbish, and it should be much clearer from politicians all around the world, especially from the democratic countries, that he's talking rubbish. I mean, let me be fair in this. It's not just Trump that has, shall we say, added to the problems of Ukraine. I think the Democrats did as well, because the Democrats hesitated so long about giving any arms to enable Ukraine to defend itself. They withheld a lot of the money that was voted. They hung on to large hundreds of billions of dollars for months and months and months. They wouldn't let Ukraine use the main weapons against Russia, which indeed Ukraine is now doing. And they tried to put Biden in, this silly old twit, and the outcome of that was always going to be that Trump would win quite comfortably. So the Democrats have to take an awful lot of blame. If America had tackled this invasion the way that they tackled the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein, perhaps the outcome would have been similar, and a dictator would have been put back in his box. But that has not happened, and Putin is now enabled, and the outcome is not going to be good.
Andrew, do you think it was ever possible to have a clean end to a war before it started, if you like?
I think, although obviously Trump is crazy saying that the Ukrainians started the war, what Tony Abbott from Australia said is completely wrong, and what Edwina Currie has just said is completely wrong. If you look back over the last 70 years, a comparison isn't to be made, really, with the Kuwait War. Think of what happened when the Russian tanks went into Prague in the 1960s. The Czechoslovakians and the West could have fought a war in which tens of thousands of people were killed, as has happened in the Ukraine, tragically. Nobody wanted that to happen if they seriously considered the situation, but they were led into it by this fantasy that it was possible to win a war against the Russian army. And in the Ukraine, that is not a possibility. It's been a proxy war anyway between America and Russia, not really a war between the small fry like us and the Ukrainians against Putin. It's a war between America and Russia. America doesn't want to fight it anymore, and the realistic picture the true picture. I know Trump is crazy, I know he's awful, but the true picture is the one that he has outlined. He doesn't want to fight it anymore, therefore the war is over, therefore the Russians, in effect, have won the war. And you've just got to accept that.
What was the alternative,
It may be morally repellent, it may be horrible to listen to these words, but this is what is the case. And if you just go on thinking, if only we'd spent a bit more money, if only the Democrats had done this, that or the other, tens of thousands of people would have been killed.
So, but what would the alternative have been? If you're suggesting
allow a proper negotiation. There are huge. I've driven through the Ukraine in the old Soviet days. You wouldn't know that you were in a different country. Everybody was speaking Russian. There wasn't the slightest sense as I drove from Moscow to Kiev and stopping tonight in Kharkov and so on, that you were going into a different country. The Russians have always believed it was part of their country. Now, of course, we don't agree with that in the West.
Well, nor does Ukraine.
And large parts of the Ukraine do, and other parts don't.
No, that's not true. That is simply not true.
The West.
Let's
Okay,
Edwina. Go on, what were you going to say?
It's simply not true. I mean, Andrew may have been there over 30, 40 years ago, but the fact is that Ukraine had the opportunity to do exactly what he says, which is say, oh, hi, Russia, welcome. And they didn't.
No, I wasn't suggesting they would say welcome. I was saying, what's the choice? The choice is...
Well, the choice is sometimes, Andrew, as we did in this country, or rather as our parents did in this country, to say, no, we are not going to accept the invasion. We prefer to have our freedom. We want to rule our country the way that we want. We want to be a democracy, and we do not want to have a dictator who does not believe in democracy and does not believe in these values ruling over us.
I know, but then you've got to lead on from that, Edwina, to think...
No, you don't have to give in.
What is the... No, I wasn't suggesting...
Hang on, time out. Edwina, Andrew said you've got to lead on from that. Do you want to...
What will happen if you do it? And what's happened so far is that tens of thousands of people have been killed, and the Western ambition hasn't been fulfilled at all, nor can it be. That's the point.
It's not a Western ambition. It's a disgraceful thing to say. It's not a Western,
ambition to build up power against Russia.
Listen, Russia has lost hundreds of thousands of troops and many, many thousands of vehicles. Its economy has been hollowed out. I mean, one of the things that I hope does come out of all of this, if this fighting stops and if Russia is stopped in its tracks, is that actually some people in Russia might think, do you know what, we much prefer to have peace. We much prefer not to have Russia on a war footing. We much prefer not to have sanctions. And maybe there will be voices raised against the old baby boomer Putin that says it's about time for the old man to retire. And maybe a new world will come in, or not a new world, but maybe more common sense will come into Russia. I don't hold out much hope for it. But you know what, Andrew, there were lots of people in 1938 in Britain who took exactly your viewpoint.
Yes,
they included the abdicated king. There were people around who thought that we should, be nice to Hitler. I don't think that's a viewpoint that most people in this country would take now, because we have the freedom not to do that. And I think we should accede that kind of freedom to Ukraine as far as possible.
Are you an appeaser then, Andrew?
Yes. I very much am an appeaser in this particular case. Hitler had no historic claims. The Germans had no historic claims over France, over Holland, over Belgium, over Great Britain. These were territories that they tried to invade and then obviously did invade in many cases, and they invaded Russia fatally. In the Russian-Ukraine quarrel, it's a question of land that's historically, much of it, not all of it, much of it has historically always been part of Russia. And unless you recognise that, you're living in cloud cuckoo land.
It hasn't. Large parts of it were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Yes, they were. But that's and they were part of Poland. But I mean, the idea that the Crimea, for example, is a separate country or is part of a country called the Ukraine is sheer fantasy.
What about the argument, though? What would have happened by your rationale, Andrew, is when Putin started rolling the tanks towards Kyiv, by your argument, no one should have stopped him.
Yes, that is my argument.
But the Ukrainians did try and stop him, so that would
and they were very brave, and of course our hearts go out to them, and of course when I see Edwina wearing a nice Ukrainian flag, my heart goes out to her too, and good luck to her lodgers. And I'm not being a horrible person here. I'm just trying to be realistic. Tens of thousands of people have been killed, in my view, unnecessarily.
But the point is, the Ukrainians said, we don't want to put up with this.
Some did.
So, well, the Ukrainian government did.
Some did.
While the millions of people who fought, many people have fought for their
Yes,
country.
yes, they
This has
have.
not been a country that rolled over, because if the country rolled over...
It didn't roll over, no.
And the question is, we had promised Ukraine certain things. We said, if you give up your nuclear arms, we will give you protection. We had some moral responsibility.
Yes, we did. We did.
So we had to act upon that.
We being the collective West, yes.
And so why didn't we have to act upon it and support them?
Well, we haven't.
Well, we have.
Edwina has just pointed out that we haven't done so adequately. And actually, we should have spent our entire national budget in the West trying to fight a war against the... nobody, except the Japanese, in the last 125 years, has ever won or could ever win a war against Russia.
And
That's also nonsense.
Because the Russians don't
lost in
care
Afghanistan.
how many people. That wasn't a proper war. That was a skirmish.
For goodness'
But
sake.
no, it wasn't.
Nonsense you're talking.
It was a skirmish compared with what's going on now. If you honestly think that we could fight a war by sending, for example, Keir Starmer said he will send. He was immediately made to withdraw it and said he was just going to send these Typhoon planes over. But he did say he was going to send land troops.
He hasn't withdrawn that.
No, he still
And
might well
hasn't
do that.
withdrawn
Well,
that.
I mean, it would be a laughing stock if he'd send a few thousand, which would be easily outnumbered.
Well, they'd send a few thousand potentially as part of a peacekeeping force, which would have the backup of American, potentially, air support.
I mean, I hate saying this, but Trump doing a negotiation which will not kill people is, to my mind, better than us strutting around in military uniform, leading to further deaths.
But that
For no good reason.